Hello again, everybody. Thank you for spending your Thursday afternoon with us and continuing to enjoy these great speakers and panels. And I'm really excited to announce that the next panel is going to focus on equity and justice as we decarbonize the energy sector. So I'd like to introduce our next panel. The title is Advancing Energy Equity, which will look at how different efforts are working to bring clean, affordable electricity and heat to underserved populations, the shifts that the clean energy transition is having on the workforce, and how addressing issues like the heat island effect can complement efforts to improve energy access. I'd like to welcome the panel and the moderator, Jamal Lewis of Rewiring America. Jamal, turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's good to be here today at this conference. I want to thank Verena and the Center for Energy and Climate Solutions for hosting this awesome conference. And it's great to see a lot of climate leaders here in the audience, including the folks that I'll be in the discussion with today. For the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about energy equity. And so what does that mean? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means to me, and then I'm going to kick it over to each of our panelists who are also going to talk about what does energy equity mean to you and how does it show up in your work. So I've got some stats here that I'm going to recite. So when I think about energy equity, I think about the fact that no one should have to live in a home without access to heat or without access to AC. No one should have to choose between paying their energy bill or paying for rent or paying for their food. And no one should have to compromise their health and well-being in order to meet their basic energy needs. Unfortunately, that is the reality that many of our neighbors face. And so now it's stat time. Over a quarter of US households are, according to the Energy Information Administration, are unable to meet their basic energy needs, whether that's bills are too high or they're worried about their bills being too high, so they compromise by turning the heat off or turning the AC off. So that's over a quarter of our neighbors who deal with that. Again, about a quarter of households have a significant energy burden, a high energy burden. So it's an industry standard that no one should be paying more than 6% of their household income on energy. But over 30.6 million households are paying more than 6%. And actually, 15.9, almost 16 million households pay more than 13%. And even some households pay up to a quarter of their income on energy. I mean, that's pretty significant. And about 5 million households reported that they were either unable to use their heating equipment or chose not to, or were unable to use their AC. So this is a reality that many households face, many of our neighbors face, that I believe should never happen. So when I think about energy equity, that's what I think about. And I work for Rewiring America, and we believe that we can achieve our climate targets while at the same time making sure that everyone meets their basic energy needs. In order to do that, our organization thinks a lot about electrification of our economy, including buildings and vehicles, which you all have heard about throughout this conference. And when we do that, when we electrify, we're able to do a few core things. We can address 42% of our energy-related emissions. The energy sector represents about 87% of our total US emissions. We can save money on energy bills. Over 99% of all Americans would save money by switching from a fossil fuel appliance to a clean electric appliance like a heat pump. You can improve health, so we can reduce the risk of experiencing asthma symptoms by 42% by not heating our homes with fossil fuels. And we can create jobs. Over 462,000 jobs can be created by transitioning our economy. So for me, I think we can do this. We have this beautiful, rosy picture of what our future can be, but now we have to get from where we are today to there. And unless we are magicians, we're going to have to think about the process to get there and what, how we can do that most equitably. So I'm now going to turn to our panel, who's going to talk a little bit about what energy equity means to them and how it shows up in the work that they do. So this is a question I added, so I'm not going to start with Kwame, but I'll start with Tricia instead.
Great, thank you, Jamal. I'm Tricia Miller. I'm at Elevate Energy, and we center equity in climate action. So equity is really rooted in the work that we do, and the definition of that would be similar to yours, I think, ensuring that everyone has access to affordable heat, power, and water, and the opportunity to thrive in the communities that they live, where they work and where they play. So that's part of why I joined the team at Elevate. I've been working the last couple decades in the field of sustainable, affordable housing and climate and energy, and really started as a civil rights attorney in working in Mississippi when Hurricane Katrina struck. So when I think about energy equity, it takes me back to 2005 when climate resilience wasn't a thing that was really talked about at conferences, and it wasn't nearly the movement that it's become now, but I was seeing it representing clients on the Gulf Coast, the need to build back after the storm in a way that supported thriving neighborhoods and met the basic needs of the residents whose lives were torn apart when 120, 140 mile an hour winds come through, and the shotgun home that's been in your family for centuries is gone, and the tidal surge is washed away. The economic center of gravity along with the residential fabric. So that really is what comes to mind for me when I think of energy equity is resilience, recovery, and ensuring that we get beyond energy insecurity and actually can be centering communities at the tip of the spear when it comes to a clean energy future.
Thank you, Tricia. Ginger?
Yeah, so for me, I have been working on a lot of heat issues within the city of Phoenix in Arizona, and so energy equity in Phoenix revolves around heat equity also in Phoenix, so access to electricity to power AC units is critical in the summer months, and also the ability to pay for that electricity, so making sure that we don't put undue burdens on our disadvantaged communities and communities of color in particular. I'm also Navajo, and I was born on the Navajo Nation, although I don't live there now. Navajo communities, over 30% of homes on the Navajo Nation lack access to electricity. And so for me, energy equity would be getting 100% of homes on the Navajo Nation access to electricity, whether it be off the grid solar PV systems or being able to tie them directly onto the grid or through microgrids. And so that is something that's important to me as far to think about our tribal communities for energy equity as well, but also the sense that for many years Navajo Nation was used to, for the coal resources that were in Navajo communities, and that coal was used to power a lot of the southwestern communities for decades. And so energy equity is also making sure that the energy that is being resourced on our communities are also going back to those same communities in one way or another.
Thank you. Thanks, Ginger. And Kwame, it's good to have you here. It sounds like you can hear us. So what does energy equity mean to you, and how does it show up in your work?
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Energy equity is very near and dear to my heart. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, and not to the Brooklyn of 2022. I grew up in Brooklyn in the late 80s and early 90s. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So energy equity, coming up in a space where you're watching your parents sort of sift through bills and figuring out, which bill they were going to pay and which bill they were going to let go into arrears. And then flash forward to my journey within this industry, working with primarily members of Congress who are of color in the tri-caucus space on the federal, state, and local level, seeing the value that our members provide locally, not only to the economy, but just to the kitchen table issue items, like making sure that energy is more increasingly affordable for customers who are in underserved and unserved communities, and making sure that the technology that is increasingly coming to play around clean energy is accessible to those communities. I originally worked for the Congressional Black Caucus, who has a mission squarely in this space. And so when I transitioned to EEI, I took that mission with me and worked to make sure that policymakers on all levels of government have access to our members and can be more involved. Because when I think of equity, I want to have a seat at the table and not be on the menu. And so making sure that there are conversations that are happening on a continuous basis with our members and their customers is very important to me. And so I center that around what I do.
Yeah, I love that. I think a lot of times we talk about climate, and we're talking about newer technologies, ones that are going to be helpful in delivering and making sure everyone has access to energy and in a way that also reduces our emissions. And I often hear like, yeah, it's unaffordable, it's unattainable for a large segment of the population, just given that they're considered commodities and not necessarily something that we all should have. And so, Tricia, I know that you and Elevate are working to install a lot of these upgrades to perform electrification in income-eligible households across the country, largely in the Midwest. I'm wondering what you're seeing there. What's the reaction, and what are some of the challenges and barriers with providing some of these technologies and upgrades to that community?
Sure. Well, we've started, the Elevate journey began about 20 years ago when there were rolling blackouts in Chicago. And so the idea was to form a collaborative to reduce energy demand and to support communities that were being hit the hardest and still are by energy insecurity and housing burdens. So that evolved into more of a delivery model to partner with community-based organizations and bring energy efficiency services and work with utilities to provide better access to affordable energy solutions in communities that were paying the premium for their residential electric and heating gas costs too. So that's where we started, was more in line with the weatherization and efficiency programs, and also offering some smart grid and opportunities to opt into utility programs that could benefit underserved communities. More recently, we're starting to try and build a platform that allows the solutions to be really centered in communities where we're being able to deliver solar rooftop or community solar solutions and provide that in tandem with energy efficiency offerings, and increasingly working with you, Jamal, and team on delivering equitable electrification, because we do see it as an opportunity to go in and have a more holistic approach to equitable building decarbonization, and not just take a piecemeal approach, but actually look at what can we do, how do we meet the affordable housing owner and resident where they are, and package a set of solutions that will reduce energy demand, lower utility cost burden, and get us on a path to decarbonizing the buildings. So that's where we're most active right now, is putting those pieces together and trying to get more demand for those offerings. Like you mentioned earlier, There's the innovative technologies, and then there's commercial deployment. And we see a chance to avoid that, kind of being last in line for things like a cold climate heat pump, and actually start to pursue deploying those technologies in the communities that need the energy solutions the most.
Yeah, that's awesome and great work. I'm a huge fan of Elevate. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that there's greenhouse gas emissions that are being trapped in our atmosphere, and it's causing our planet to warm. And I think one thing that I think people are generally aware of as well is that that's happening on a more micro scale within cities as well. And it's a phenomenon called the heat island effect. And then I think the New York Times, or there was some big publication that came out a couple years ago that said some neighborhoods within the same city actually have, the temperatures can actually fluctuate by 10 to 20 degrees. And we're seeing that low-income households, Black and brown households actually have hotter neighborhoods for various reasons. We talked about nature-based solutions. A lot of times these neighborhoods don't have a lot of those nature-based solutions that can be helpful in cooling down a community. And so I know, Ginger, that you're working on some solutions to address that heat island effect in Phoenix. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how you're seeing that play out, and what are some ways that you're working to make it more equitable?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I have been working to make Phoenix a more resilient city, especially to the impacts of increasing and more extreme heat in Phoenix. So in 2021, Phoenix had 104 days above 100 degrees, and 22 of those days were above 110 degrees. So that's almost a month above 110 degrees. And so I know that in many parts of our country, heat is a public health issue, but in Phoenix, it can be a matter of life and death in a matter of hours. And so extreme heat, we all know, can lead to dehydration, heat stress, heat stroke. And so in Phoenix, the number of people dying from heat is increasing year over year. For example, in 2001, there was 21 heat deaths, and last year there were 323 heat deaths. So it is slowly climbing up year after year, and it's given the climate projections, I guess we're not anticipating those going down anytime soon, unless there is some drastic measures taken for addressing heat in communities. One of the main reasons that people are dying is because they cannot afford to turn on the air conditioning units in their homes, or they can afford them, but they are just too worried about the cost of electricity to turn those air conditioning units on. Another issue is homeless people dying on the streets from heat. And so some of the ways that we're trying to address this in Phoenix is addressing the built environment, the nature-based solutions that were talked about before. So one of the strategies that we put forth as far as the community subcommittee that I lead on urban heat island tree and shade issues, the subcommittee advocated that the city install a heat office and tree administrator, so a point person within the city that can maintain all of the data, all of the information that all city departments are dealing with regarding heat, because it affects a wide range of city departments. And so I'm happy to say that last year, as part of our advocacy, the city of Phoenix installed the first publicly funded heat officer in the nation, and that will includes a built environment. Thank you.
There you go.
It includes a built environment specialist, and it also includes a tree administrator, so a point person that will be responsible for maintaining the tree inventory in our city, making sure that those trees survive. Other solutions that we put forth are a network of cool corridors in our cities, and so that's planting along our arterial highways and other major streets, a network of tree-lined walkways, especially in those communities that lack access to trees. There are certain parts of our communities, as you can imagine, the more affluent areas that have access to irrigated lots, irrigated water, which comes with more vegetation, more trees, more shade canopy. And the lowest income parts of our cities lack all of that access and are far hotter, up to 10 degrees hotter in our city. And that is something that we've been working on, trying to steer our public resources to the most heat vulnerable areas first. And so I know our city and a lot of cities like to kind of equally distribute resources throughout the city into council districts, but we're trying to get our city council to understand that equity doesn't necessarily mean everything's equally distributed. It means that everyone is equally covered. And so some areas need the resources a lot more than others, and we should be sending those resources. And so we're getting the city council to look at planting these corridors in areas that need it the most, that are the most heat vulnerable. We're also looking at ideas such as cool roofs, cool pavements, and green infrastructure, and asking the city just to implement a heat equity policy overall. And all of these will help with our energy issues because extreme heat heightens the need, like I mentioned before, for reliable power and affordable power. And so the more that we can do to lower those temperatures, the less that we will need to rely on electricity to cool our homes if we can get some of that cooling from natural solutions or other types of solutions. Other programs like utility shutoff moratoriums will also help, especially in those high extreme heat days, and especially for the lower income households that have no other options. And then stuff like solar rooftop panels, that it just needs to be more accessible so that cheaper, I mean, Arizona has an abundance of solar energy, and so it's just unfortunate that most low-income renters are not homeowners, and they don't have the option of taking advantage of solar resources. And so that's something, as far as energy equity, that needs to be resolved, or there needs to be more incentives for landlords to be putting on solar on top of rooftops. And I just want to also mention that I've been involved in a lot of these conversations at the City of Phoenix level, but the municipal area, the regional area has many other municipalities in it, and Phoenix is taking a lead on this area, but we need a regional resilience approach to this and heat issue, energy issues overall, and that's just not happening yet within Arizona. So thank you.
That is a perfect segue, because I know, Kwame, that you work with many states. Your organization has members in a bunch of different states across the country. What are you seeing in terms of, what states are doing to, address our climate crisis, but also make sure that everyone has access to basic energy needs, and how are you seeing states do that equitably?
Well, I'm seeing it in our members' filings at the regulatory level. Two states in particular, New Jersey and Colorado. PSEG recently had one of the largest commitments to energy efficiency and clean energy in the state's history, to the tune of about $1 billion invested in communities. And they expressly spoke to the commission about energy equity and what that would mean for jobs. They're working with organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League to help proliferate those jobs through not-for-profits that would serve underserved and unserved communities. Colorado had an energy plan that was focused on this as well. And so I'm seeing, at least from my vantage point, I'm seeing our members be more intentional about this space and how we work in it and operate in it. And also from a procurement and the supply diversity perspective, the investments that our companies are making have a multiplying effect on the supply chain, which inherently creates more economic activity, and that could really help out small businesses that we are looking to be a part of our downstream spend. I think equity, not only in jobs and workforce, but equity in the procurement and space is going to really bring companies to the table. And we're looking to make sure that we have a level playing field in that space.
Yeah, that is great work. And We're going to open it up to some questions from the audience. If you have any questions, I think we have the capacity to go around and do that. But I just want to ask one more question, which is, each of you has talked about the need to make sure that these newer, cleaner, healthier technologies are able to be deployed in the most vulnerable, the most at-risk communities. What's stopping us right now from doing that? What are the challenges? And then how are you seeing your partners, or how are you working to address some of those challenges? Tricia, we'll start with you.
Okay, sure. So I think there's always the question of how to scale solutions. We have a lot of great models, and efforts like the Federal Justice 40 initiative are key to reorient some of the direct federal investment and benefits of the clean energy economy in underserved communities. So I'm optimistic that we'll have states and cities replenishing their budgets that have been dwindling and for far too long, and target new reinvestment in a way that will advance equity and ensure that things like lead service line replacement, energy efficiency projects, and solar deployment are benefiting communities that have been left behind. So I think that the ability to kind of target direct public investment is needed, and the barriers to entry have been tremendous in the past, and that's part of what we're seeing running a Justice 40 accelerator. So the idea behind that was to get frontline organizations, environmental justice groups, community development organizations prepared before new federal money hits the streets to add capacity and plan for accessing federal investment. So that's, I think, one key area is doing more of that matchmaking intermediary role to help support communities that could really benefit from renewed public and private investment. And then the second is on the scaling with private dollars and corporate commitments. I think we're really missing an opportunity in the voluntary carbon offset market, in commitments to renewable energy credits and going carbon neutral at the corporate level. There are a lot of projects that could be aggregated in places like Chicago, Phoenix, really all over the country that could meet that threshold for qualifying for a carbon offset. And we've started to pilot that with a couple of large investors that are looking to do carbon offsets and bringing projects that are equitable, building electrification and solar projects, and presenting that as a way to support direct investments or offsets and start to scale solutions. We could do the same, I think, in Phoenix, as you were talking about the split incentive issue. It's really hard for affordable housing owners to invest in solar that will offset the electric load for the residents when it's tenant paid. But if you could find a way to take advantage of the direct solar investment through a voluntary offset program, you could start to see that ability to really crowdsource funding that could scale up solar solutions.
Yeah.
So that's just one example, but I think there are many more, and I'd love to hear from the audience as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Ginger, I'm really curious about this question in the context of tribal communities and tribal energy sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what are you seeing there in terms of barriers to getting to this healthier, cleaner, more renewable future for us, and how are you seeing solutions being deployed there?
Yeah, so Arizona itself is in the midst of an energy transition. So we're transitioning a lot of our coal plants offline within the next 10 years. And so, like I mentioned before, some of those coal resources are on the Navajo Nation, they're in tribal communities. And so tribal communities also have significant renewable resources as well. And so it's an opportunity to transition off of fossils into renewable energy areas for these communities, but it's going to take work. tribal communities have for many decades relied on that economic development aspect of the fossil fuel industry. And so we need to make sure that our communities are able to transition in a healthy way and be supported by the state and by the outside communities that were for so long built on the backs of our tribal communities. And so, for example, the Navajo Nation, with the closure of the Navajo Generating Power Plant within the last few years, the tribe's annual budget was cut by about 23%. And so this cut impacts schools, hospitals, libraries, and funding for public services on the nation. And so Navajo is going to have to think about how to replace that economic development opportunity. Either it could be through the energy sector, or it could be through development of economic opportunities in other sectors of the economy. But it is something that would be benefited by state participation. One key area that would help would be if our state of Arizona had an energy office that could kind of consolidate this information, make sure all communities are being taken care of in this transition, deal with the transition so that it's equitable and just, and all of the environmental justice issues that go along with energy planning. But the state had an energy office at the state level, I think up until 2015, and it's no longer there. And so that's something that would greatly help in all of this transition. The Navajo Nation is the size of West Virginia, and homes are very rural, they're very spread out, and there are many constraints to getting equitable access across the nation. That could include lack of Wi-Fi and cell phone access, lack of paved roads and running water, and also financing options for families themselves because of the lack of economic opportunities. And so these are all part of the challenges to electrifying 100% of Navajo Nation. In addition, the nation doesn't have a very robust community planning endeavor, and so they're continually letting home sites be located in very remote areas that are hard to reach. And so off-grid solar PV projects are one solution that is being considered and also implemented by utilities, by NGOs, but also in community clustered areas. If we can get community development and planning to start planning communities in a sensible way, we can start to implement microgrids and other PV storage options that will help electrify a lot of Navajo communities. In addition, there's transmission issues. If Navajo wants to serve as a utility scale energy provider in the future, we need transmission lines that go to those solar resource areas so that that power can be sold back to the grid, back to electric utilities in Arizona and California. So one of the major issues is tribes having the technical capability to do this alone. Navajo is one of the largest tribes in the country, and Navajo has a lot of technical capabilities, but there are 22 tribal nations in Arizona, and not all of them have the technical engineering background, just budget to do this type of planning. And so the state and federal government, it would help if they could come in and help tribal communities plan and help give the resources, the budgetary resources to do this planning within tribal communities themselves. I think that's all I had.
Well, that is plenty for
Thank
sure.
you.
I'm going to ask Kwame, but I just want to gut check. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah? Okay. So we'll get to you. So this transition, Kwame, we obviously have talked about, someone who currently is heating their homes with fossil fuels, having that home transition to clean, renewable electric energy without compromising any of their, without compromising their ability to meet their basic energy needs. I think that sometimes is considered to be like the crux of the issue. But there's another sort of side of that, which is which is Ginger alluded to, you've got the fossil fuel industry really entrenched in many of these communities in terms of jobs, right? Like the fossil fuel companies are often big employers in different parts of the country. And so, as we're starting to transition away from fossil fuel and companies and transition more to clean electricity, what are we doing with those jobs? And how are we ensuring that there's a just transition for those workers? And I know that you've been working in that space quite a bit. What are you seeing there?
Well, it's a challenge. I think the recent infrastructure bill is going to help with a glide path because of this. There's been so much investment in areas that my colleagues just touched on broadband, and just really like roads and bridges, making sure that communities are connected so that you can bring commerce to small and rural towns. I know my sector specifically is focusing on middle mile broadband because we are, a lot of focus has been on cities, but for those folks who live in mid-sized and small rural areas, how do you bring commerce and productivity to their areas and making sure that they have a seat at the table as well? And so states like Alabama have really done yeoman's work and making sure that utilities can play an active role in providing some infrastructure around middle mile broadband. That's the space that we want to play in. But also, I touched on it before, like in the procurement space, all the investments that our companies are making in this clean energy future, we want to make sure that there is an opportunity for entrepreneurship for Black and Brown and folks who are in the kaleidoscope of all things diversity to make sure they have a seat at the table in the ownership opportunities that are inherent in the amount of resources that our companies are going to have to spend to proliferate this transition into clean energy and the technologies that will be born out of that. So I think it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that our companies are stepping up and helping to make a reality. So I'm looking forward to where we're going to be in the next 10 years.
I love that. I love challenges too. I coach youth flag football, and my 4th and 5th grade team was the last seed of the playoffs, made it to the championship.
Nice.
Now don't ask me what happened then, but we got one question from the audience.
Well, first I want to thank you all so much for being here and for this amazing discussion. So with the climate crisis becoming more extreme every year, how do we make sure to continue to engage with underserved communities as we work with more urgency to transition the energy sector to renewables?
Who wants to take that one?
Want me to take it?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think we just need to remember that underserved communities are going to be disproportionately affected by climate issues, and so we need to make sure that resources are steered toward those communities first to address these issues. With tribal communities, I mean, we Native people are indigenous to the lands. We've been we've been the caretakers of our lands for generations, and I think we also need to incorporate some of that indigenous knowledge into our resilience measures as well. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from tribal communities as partners in solving some of these resilience issues. And so I think part of it is just making sure that tribal communities have a seat at the table. And so making sure that our voices are heard, that when conversations are being had about what to do about certain issues, climate-related issues, that tribes are just involved, because a lot of times tribes are forgotten. And so I think that's one very easy way to make sure that we are not forgetting communities, is to bring them all to the table.
I love that. Trisha, Kwame? No?
I would just add that, part of with Justice 40 is trying to build that reparative, restorative framework and change the conversation so that the voices that have been advocating for climate justice are not only heard, but the projects that the solutions that really are centered in the community they're there. And we need a roadmap to be able to invest in those solutions and to support the community leaders and projects that, if not considered shovel ready, are shovel worthy, and help us get, into a different trajectory in terms of the relationship we have with advancing climate action that's really centered on local solutions in tribes, in rural communities, in urban areas. And so if you're looking for some of those projects, again, the Justice 40 Accelerator is a nice cross-section of 52 organizations across the country right now that are lifting up some of those models, including with some tribal nations. So I'm excited about those opportunities, and I think we really have to rethink the relationship with setting policy and public and private investment and lifting up climate equity solutions.
Yeah, and I find it helpful, and I see we got a question there, to reframe the conversation, because the conversation is often how it's going to be costly to transition. Well, for a lot of communities, it is already costly, and so let's do what we can to transition in a way that minimizes that impact.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
So one more thing I think is electing leaders that are going to vote to invest in these communities as well. So I think that's one of the major ways that we can all put this forefront.
Sure. Let's go.
Thank you so much. I think that this question is at first glance probably better positioned for Ginger, but I really welcome insights from the others as well. I support cities and counties and other local jurisdictions write climate action or climate adaptation and resilience plans. So my question is, what advice, lessons learned, best practices would you give those cities who are starting to think about extreme heat more seriously, and specifically the equity implications that result from it? Because we always look at Maricopa County as one of the leading examples of doing really good work in this space. Thank you.
Well, that's good to hear. I like to hear that we're one of the leaders. But I would say start with figuring out, well, one of the first things we did was when we wanted to get the tree administrator hired, we put together in our citizen committee a business case for that. So we knew the city budget process was coming up. We learned about how to advocate within the budget process and how our council members were going about taking into consideration the public comments in that budget process, but also backing up what we wanted with a justification of how it was going to benefit the city in all aspects. So in financial aspects, what kind of grants that person can bring in to the city, what types of environmental benefits hiring this type of person would have, and then what type of public health benefits there were. And so we went through and did a very robust analysis. I mean, and we were not experts in the area, but we were involved enough and had enough brain power, I guess, between I think we had like 14 people in our committee, that we were able to put together something that was very convincing in terms of convincing the mayor and city council of why this position was needed and what our city would benefit from it. And so I would start with the business case for everything first, because unfortunately, like, we're driven probably in this room by our passion for the climate and for the environmental issues, but outside of this room, people are driven by money and by a business. And so I think we need to put things in terms of economic benefits whenever possible to justify the action that we want on our climate issues.
Awesome. So we're at time, and so I just wanted to give our panel a thank you for sharing your experiences with the audience, and thank you all for being here. I know it's approaching late in the conference, but really appreciate you all for being here and for listening to us today. So thank you. Thank you, Kwame, for joining us.
Thank you, and I want to echo my thanks to Jamal, Kwame, Tricia, and Ginger for that very, very important discussion that shed light on how we can think about and design the clean energy transition in ways that incorporate an equity lens up front.